All right, welcome to Perennial Podcast, Episode 3. I had in mind to discuss some varying theories of morality. As many of you might know, I used to be a moral nihilist, and probably to some extent, aspects of that thinking is still influential for the way that I interpret morality. But Ken made a recent video that covered three kind of primary values according to kind of continental civilizational groups that might shed some light on a more general theme that I've kind of picked up on in moral theories, which is that any coherent moral theory, besides perhaps moral nihilism, must select one attribute or aspect as the focal point of the rest of its moral calculus. I do kind of subscribe to the notion that all moral theories inevitably blend into some variant of utilitarianism, whether they place pleasure as primary or persistence, existence as primary, or something more transcendent like beauty or a kind of aesthetic ideal of the good. But Ken, can you go over some of the stuff that you talked about? Because I thought that was a pretty interesting division that you drew.
Is between emotionalism, asceticism, and aesthetics. Emotionalism covers a whole host of ideologies and political theories like utilitarianism, capitalism, communism, and so on. Even you could say democracy often falls under here. Just an appeal to either maximizing the most amount of pleasure for the most amount of people or minimizing as much as possible for the most amount of people, and variations on that theme. So capitalism takes it in the more pleasure-heavy direction where, okay, maybe some people are poor, there are some losers in the system, but it maximizes pleasure. And then communists are more focused on the pain. We want to eliminate poverty. We don't care if that means we have less billionaires or something like that. And so you see this reflected in art, right? If you look at pornography, it's all about stimulating really basic animalistic emotions. I mean, we share these emotional systems with animals. Or you look at horror movies or gore porn, stuff that's really supposed to shock you. It's all about exciting the emotions. I guess popular entertainment, it's thought of as good if it can move you emotionally, make you cry, make you laugh, a comedy, a tragedy. And so if that's the focus and that's the goal of art, is to inspire just basic emotion, then we could put that under the category of emotionalism. Now, in contrast to that is asceticism, and asceticism really tries to detach oneself from desires and emotions and to instead focus on letting go of those things. You could say there's an aspect of emotionalism in it of we want to avoid pain, we want to avoid suffering, and the Epicurean path or the Buddhist path is to eliminate suffering by letting go of all emotions. No sadness, no happiness, no ups or downs. This was also an aspect of cynicism, of the Greek cynics. So that is something that's been very prevalent in East Asia. Obviously, Buddhism is one of the big ones as far as the number of followers. And you can see it in East Asian art. If you go to Asia, you can see how there's a huge emphasis on cleanliness, this elimination of a return to simplicity. Everything is clean. It's all about clearing the mind, eliminating distractions. It's a very meditative, friendly environment. A lot of the music, it's very calming. You move on to the third one, which is aesthetics. And aesthetics might have emotional elements to it, aesthetic art. And it might even have aesthetic elements to it, simplicity. But ultimately, it is not seeking merely pleasure or pain, and it's not seeking the elimination of desires and goals and nirvana, but rather it is seeking this limitlessness. And we can look at different aspects of that. We could talk about infinity as an aspect of limitlessness, or eternity, or perfection. And these three categories are all kind of a striving for divinity. And so you see that in artwork, which it's not meant to make you happy, it's not meant to make you laugh or cry, but it's meant to inspire this sense of awe. It's meant to connect you to divinity, and it's not concerned with eliminating desire. It's not concerned with returning to nothingness, but it's about the infinity. And you could say that there's a complementary nature between asceticism and aesthetics. That whereas aestheticism seeks the infinity in nothingness, aesthetics seeks infinity in magnitude and power and glory and those kind of things. So these three systems, they all have a degree of opposition and a degree of contrast to one another. But oftentimes you find in artwork, you find a mixture of two or even all three of these elements. And really what I was looking at in that video when I talked about these different cultures and groupings of people is that we're seeing a drive away from aesthetics and a drive toward emotionalism. Funny enough, this has produced a lot of people who are like in the West, more and more people going for Buddhism than ever before. I mean, there was an Orientalism in the 19th century. It was big then, but now it's this popular movement. It's not just academics, but it's popular, people, just hippies or whatever, uneducated people going for Buddhism, going for meditation, reaching for Eastern spirituality, valuing asceticism, the Neo-Luddites, the Ted Kaczynskis, the environmentalists who want to remove aesthetics and go back to nature, go back to simplicity. So I see these trends happening, and I identify them with different groups of people. As I said, I think East Asians, the asceticism is really prominent with Jews. Emotionalism is really prominent, and that's part of their survival strategy we can go into. And for white people, that has been aesthetics. And so the changing morality of the world really has to do with these changing cultural groups and these changing racial groups.
This division corresponds pretty much exactly with the Platonic tripartite division of the soul, as well as the Hindu tripartite division of the soul. In the Hindu narrative, there is the tamasic guna or energy, there's the rajasic, and then the sattvic. The sattvic corresponding to the ascetic, the rajasic corresponding to, as you term it, the aesthetic, and then the tamasic corresponding to what was the term you used?
Emotional?
Emotional, yeah. So in Plato's terminology, that would be, the bottom would be the appetitive, and then the second level would be more like a conscious will or striving, and then the top level would be reason. And the reason in Buddhism does receive a primary emphasis, unlike virtually any other religious tradition. There really is a coherent metaphysic to Buddhism. Now, I'm not drawn to this kind of myopic asceticism. My view is that all three of these aspects are present, as you say, in every civilization, and some kind of proper sort or order or hierarchy among these needs to be established. But in your view, how obviously by cultural heritage predilection, you'd probably gravitate towards the aesthetic, towards beauty as the highest ideal. But do you think that we can justifiably say that there is a highest level to this division?
Well, it might be contextual, and this might go back to how you're talking about moral nihilism, we can imagine scenarios in which asceticism and simplicity and letting go of desire could be advantageous in terms of maintaining your life. We could also think of situations in which this worship of, you know, beauty in a grand scale, worship of civilization, worship of monumentalism could be advantageous from an evolutionary perspective. And of course, emotionalism is something that we share with, all other animals. So emotionalism is, from that perspective, almost the most basic type there that we share with so many other organisms. Whereas asceticism and aesthetics, we could find, perhaps we could find little indications of this in the animal kingdom. I mean, we could say that the ant hill is somehow monumental to the ants, or that we could compare certain periods as a period of asceticism. And in East Asian kind of explanations or narratives or folk tales, when they talk about animals, they characterize them in this way, talking about their different characteristics and moralities, anthropomorphizing them. But when you look at the structure of the human brain, there is a hierarchy, at least chronologically. In the back, we have our emotionalism, and then in the middle, you could say that we have our probably aesthetics would come next, and then finally there would be an asceticism, which is this self-denial. It's kind of apparent in our just evolutionary history of going from like lizards maintaining that structure but building upon like an ape-like brain, and then finally building on the human part of the brain that distinguishes us from other apes. That's where we get this powerful self-denial that other animals, they act according to instinct, they act according to rote memory and learned behavior, but it's very difficult to conceive of an animal starving itself. It's not to say that this is impossible or that it's never happened, especially you start getting into like elephants or dogs or something. You might be
What
able to
about
find some
whales?
examples, but
Whales beach themselves sometimes. We have a hard time accounting for that
right,
behavior.
yeah, and whales have this humongous brain, which doesn't mean that they're smarter than humans, but certainly having all of that brain space gives them the potential for kind of higher cognitive behaviors that we wouldn't find in other animals. So, as probably the emotionalism, I would, very strongly say is in the hind part of your brain. It's near the brainstem. But, the aesthetics versus asceticism, which kind of comes first? I mean, is it easier to imagine a chimpanzee starving itself? Or is it easier to imagine a chimpanzee building a monument to God? Or both are kind of hard to conceive, but imagination, you could see kind of an inkling of those tendencies in animal behavior. And I think that would be a question for some kind of biologist who's really studied it. Which of those do you think has come first?
Well, I'm not a biologist either in terms of evolutionary biology, but thinking about it in terms of literary criticism through that lens, I think all of these values are integrated in a common apprehension of some gradient between a universal aspect and a particular aspect, the lowest being the most particular, the actual sensations and feelings that we have. And then the aesthetic level, great works of art highlight universalities, and bigger, more monumental works deal with more universal issues. Now, the most universal of all is the sine qua non of being itself, the very act of um, awareness, if it's even an act, like just the bare presence of things. And so that would be seen as the highest ideal. Now, I somehow get the feeling that an aspect of that is present, at least in higher mammals, because I look at the way certain farm animals will just stand and stare off into space. It's like you'd have to imagine they can't be in this pleasure seeking mentality all the time. There has to be some kind of break. So, from an evolutionary perspective, I mean, the same reason that we have sleep, the Hindus often like to mention the relevance of sleep and kind of experiencing every day a return to this absolute stillness. So, for the same reason that our brains need that rest and return to the most universal attribute, I think that this moment, and I think Marcel Proust also kind of captured that as the highest virtue in his kind of like hedonistic pursuit of his famous, I forget what the title of the novel is. I didn't actually read it. I listened to a video that reviewed it at one point on a philosophy channel. But anyway, he goes through the basically the levels of moral value that you talk about. He pursues pleasure, and then pursues fame, and then pursues like the high arts and gets in with those kinds of people, and ultimately feels this sense of ennui, this sense of angst, and like a lack of satisfaction no matter where he looks. And then in the end of the novel, he ends up concluding that the most satisfying thing in life, not the fame, not fortune, not sex, not any of that, is the little moments where you just have this kind of separation from the involvement of the will and just perceive things for what they are. And I think that is akin to the state that is sought in meditation. Schopenhauer also describes this as one of the roots of aesthetic experience. So I suspect that mammals share this. I do. Um, but
Cole is really big into the power of now and just perceiving things and acting. So yeah, the cow staring off into the distance would be, and that's maybe part of why the Hindus worship the cow, because it's so often just staring off into the distance like it's meditating or something. Um, but yeah, it's definitely. I look at these different tendencies, and I see them as somewhat inherent in people of the degree that they're going to follow one or the other. And when you started to bring up a tripartite Platonic system, my immediate thought was like, you got your bronze people, you got your iron people, you got your golden people. And so, kind of what I was getting in with that, I mean, people are okay to talk about this philosophical stuff, and we can talk about Schopenhauer and all these people, but then you start to bring in, okay, a culture and groups of people, and that's where it starts to get dicey. And even on an individual level, I mean, it's hard for people because they have this idea inherent in universalism, which is part of these systems, that there is one best system and that everyone should be following one of the three systems. So the Buddhists think we should all be Buddhists, or that's the most noble path, or something like that. And then the aesthetics, or those who believe in a system of aesthetics, they're thinking that everyone should be pushed toward that direction. And the emotionalists think, oh, that's all a bunch of wasted time. Just enjoy life while you have it, or flee from pain. When I set up this three-part division, I wasn't just thinking about it in purely philosophical terms, which a lot of people have done much better than I have, but to divide it between three major cultures in the world, and to say that you're going to have an inherent tendency as part of this culture, and then within that culture, you're going to have different people who are set with these three different tendencies. And also relating to the Hindu class system or the caste system, That is not a unique phenomenon either. I mean, that is present in many societies, especially Indo-European societies. In Norse mythology, they have three types of people. Then it's connected with something like the color of your hair. So you have the what are they
It's
called? This not Sklavs. Well, the Scrawlings. I
I
think
don't remember the
there's
Norse
the
term, but
lowest,
yeah,
and
it's blondes and then redheads and then
right.
brunettes.
Yeah, so it's by the color of the hair, and it's the Scrawlings are at the bottom, and then there's two other classifications. But again, they're associated with these kinds of three systems, where the Scrawlings are governed by their emotions, and then you have you can also think about it as the Indo-European. You have kind of the farmers, the priests, and the warriors. And the priests are, of course, the ascetics, and the warriors would be seeking for aesthetics, which is why if we think about a priest might have not too attractive features because he's not concerned with reproduction. He's not concerned with survival. He might have a weak chin and a big head. I was watching it's called Looks Theory is the channel on YouTube. And has a very good video on the occipital bone and how it relates to attractiveness. And so
Oh, real
obviously the
quick,
warrior cape. Oh, go
Rattle
ahead.
says that the three categories are thrall, carl, and jarl. Apparently,
Okay, throw. I probably got scrowling from like
maybe
some
that's orcs or
RPG or
something.
something. I think I got it from that Norse one. I forget what it's called, but yeah, thrall, Carl, and Jarl. Yeah, that sounds good. Um, but yeah, if your focus is survival, your focus is warfare, your focus is reproduction, then aesthetics plays a huge part in your life. I mean, the art of war. Um, it is it is something where you're trying to become limitless in your ability to conquer and to win and to succeed. So as a result, you're going to see those kind of militant lineages or that class of society, most aesthetics. That's their drive. That's their will. Whereas someone who's just emotional, what's their appearance going to be? It's going to be perhaps exaggerated in terms of their body type is going to have it's going to appeal to like basic animalistic drive for reproduction
They
in
might
terms
be,
of
if they're a
just having
female, steatopygeus. If they're a male,
right,
massy.
Hottentots basically.
Yeah. Um, this is actually covered by Huxley in his book, The Perennial Philosophy, the physical features of the three types, and corresponds basically with what you're saying. The highest type, the sattvic ideal, or the ascetic, as you put it, has slender features, kind of like almost seems like they're on their way out, just visually. There's not much to
Right,
them. The
right,
heroic archetype is more massy, has an impression of power just by their appearance. And then the pleasure indulgent, hedonistic type makes room for sensuous engagement. And they're the kind of person who has like skin that it's stretchy and puffy and they get sweaty easy. That's kind of what comes to mind for me. But the implication obviously arises that if these types are physiologically based, then not only can we derive some kind of physiognomy from these tripart divisions and their correlate phenotypes, but also we'll see uh, different distributions of these types in different ethnic types. And that will correspond to where those types are in the cycle of their civilization. So a declining civilization is one that descends into hedonism. An ascendant civilization may be one with the heroic affect. And then the kind of the pinnacle state is one where you are just content and you feel comfortable resting. So, I mean, just if you want to venture some guesses, where do you put the various types now present?
Right. So yeah, definitely. We're looking at basically three periods of a cycle of history, or three states in which a civilization can be in: decline, then kind of maintenance, and then growth. And so, definitely, the ascetic path is best for the maintenance of society, and this is why people will comment about China or Asia that it's very good at stagnating. It's very good at maintaining systems for a long period of time. Whereas you look at Europe, and it's just had this explosive growth that is, I mean, we can compare it to other things in history. We can compare it to the Indo-European explosion. So, it's not entirely unprecedented, but it really is something monumental. Whereas the emotional type is not stagnation, it's not growth, it is certainly decline. And you can see this in Africa, where you have a aid program which gives out food to people, and the aid program, you have African authors writing, "Stop, please stop giving these people food, because it's actually hurting a lot of parts of the economy where people aren't then growing their own food." You can talk about it with India, for instance, of how they're don't sell us computers because we're not building our own computer industry. So the emotional system basically just takes resources and consumes it. An ascetic system doesn't try to hoard resources, but it doesn't consume them either. It keeps them at a steady pace, well within the budget. Whereas the system of aesthetics is explosive exponential growth.
Constant
And
creativity.
certainly, yeah, constant growth, growth without limits. Just keep going toward the stars. So, with these three systems in mind, if Western civilization has more emotionalism in its culture and its popular art, then it is necessarily going to become more of a consumer culture, and all of that, which it has produced already, is
Yeah.
going to be eaten up, eventually depleted, and there's going to be some point at which you think bottom, and you either have to maintain that or come way back up.
hmm From a musicological perspective, which that's the aspect of European art and culture that I'm best versed with, but we can trace this almost exactly. I mean, the doctrine of the affect and what music was meant to convey was universal. It was also firmly aesthetic and not ascetic music, as some like Chinese court music might be. It's not just contemplative, it's also
Definitely.
meant to arouse these emotions, but they're not sensuous, private, kind of hedonistic emotion. They are participation in universal aspects of human nature. And the Baroque era is the pinnacle of this. I mean, this develops from the medieval period. I mean, you can see cycles within cycles, because the medieval period was more that ascetic type ambiance, and then it moves into the Renaissance with extreme polyphony. Now, it's more hedonistic than the Baroque in a sense, because the Baroque period formalizes things and establishes very fixed archetypes and forms. That runs counter to the narrative of the cycle of the ages, because you'd expect it to go from ascetic to um, down to the next level, right? That's the way the phases of the yugas go, right? You go from the highest to the next highest, and down the chain. But anyway, this is my interpretation of the actual music. And then the classical period, you have an intensely personal shift, and you get chromatic passing tones that don't fit into the harmonic structure. They are unique to the composer, and that's what makes someone like Mozart so distinctive. You can listen to 100 pieces by Haydn and never really feel like you're leaving that zone of the general affect. He's repeating these forms over and over, and it's always pleasant, you know.
Right.
But Mozart gets into that, and then Beethoven takes it to the next degree, and it's intensely personal, and not just indulgent yet. It's not hedonistic music. It's just personal, willful music, conveying the nature of the individual. And for Beethoven, it conveys his struggle. And then as we move further into the Romantic period, you get to figures like Wagner, which it is a personal narrative, but it's not a universal struggle of good and evil per se. It's really more so indulgence in what he perceives to be his own identity. And I think it's telling that Richard Wagner really only liked his own music. He wasn't a big fan of the music of other composers, especially his contemporaries. So that trend is clearly evident. Other aspects of Western art also depict this. Now, kind of just jumping back a couple thousand years, if you look at the way that Greeks perceived art, so in the Republic and in the Laws, Plato talks about how important it is to solidify the artistic genres, and he looks up to in the Laws Egypt as the exemplar of this, and he's actually very anthropologically correct in that assessment, because now we do know from the time of the Narmer Palette, 3100 BC, all the way up to the Ptolemaic period, the artistic style is basically static. And that's an intensely hieratic civilization, autocratic civilization. And I kind of, just to move the conversation forward, where would you put that Egyptian type? Is it equivalent to the Oriental kind of stasis and asceticism, or?
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting question. Camille Paglia, who really opened me up to a lot of this stuff, basically says that Egypt is the start of Western civilization. She doesn't go back to the Minoans. I think she kind of mentions the Hottentot figures in prehistoric Europe, but she really wants to start with Egypt and the bust of Nefertiti. I think it's a good place to start. Um, there's this significant amount of realism in ancient Egypt that arrives that isn't quite comparable to anywhere else. I mean, and it's fuzzy because occasionally I see these Zoroastrian statues from or something from Babylon or something, but the time scales aren't synced up enough in my head to exactly correlate them or connect them together. But the Egyptian really stands out as there's this explosive growth, and in fact, to even find the intermediary forms is difficult. Of where you go from an extremely primitivistic art to finally you have a human face that's just as realistic as anything created in 3D modeling today or something like that, at least to my untrained eye. So, where does this explosive growth come from? And then why does it, as you say, why does it solidify and stagnate for so long and remain as it is? It from kind of a group theory perspective or cultural or racial perspective, it's that all of a sudden Egypt had this influx of a radically different population that caused an explosion in its development. But then this explosion went away because there was a solidified caste system. There was an assimilation of this population into the broader population, and so they maintained the art. They maintained what they had learned. There was cultural creation, but then there was a culture-bearing aspect to Egypt, in which, yes, they had developed this culture, but they weren't able to build further on top of it. They weren't able to further create. They could only bear it, and they could only continue it on for future generations. And they did so for a very long time. It was an extremely stable system. So
I'm looking for. I was going to show a book to the camera, but that I've just been reading Joseph Farrell's original book in his series. And if you don't know about Joseph Farrell, he has the News and Views from the Nefarium podcast, I guess you would call it, every week on Thursdays on YouTube. But so I've been watching that for years. I recently subscribed to his website and been watching his other content, but I bought his first book, and it's called the Giza Death Star. And his hypothesis, which he kind of borrows from Zacharias Sitchin's and then develops it is that the Great Pyramid was in fact a weapon of mass destruction, and he has some interesting like corollaries to modern physical theories to support it. But anyway, the hypothesis underlying it is that what we know as ancient Egyptian civilization is actually a vestigial civilization. It's a remnant of some more developed or more originary group in the ancient past. Now, you can interpret that and say that that's true if you just say that the Egyptian civilization was inherited from Sumer ultimately, and Sumer was inherited from the high Neolithic cultures of the upper Tigris and Euphrates. Originally Göbekli Tepe. So like, there's that line of more realistic interpretation, but it's interesting that when I ask you about Egypt and how where they fall in that kind of tripartite scheme, you're left wondering at the relative stability. It's like it's advanced and it's stable all of the sudden. And this used to be a trope in Egyptology, where people would wonder at how we don't see transitional phases. Now, more modern Egyptologists will say that no, there's all this new evidence about small steps that were made, but I don't know to what extent I can really trust the current anthropology, to be honest. But
So my problem with that new, and I mean, if there's new research, I'm open to new research. But some of my problem with that is that, yeah, you might be able to find intermediary forms. But one of the problems with that is that an intermediary form could just be people trying to learn the craft, making something as a practice, selling it off for cheap, and so they can eventually work up to that master craft. So just finding intermediary forms on its own is not enough. You have to find a previous iteration of the culture or a different culture that then evolved into Egyptian culture. And so when I look at these ancient Egyptian representations that are so realistic, I mean, we're talking about something that was in ancient Greece and Rome and then was lost during what we commonly call the Dark Ages and then came back in the Enlightenment or the Renaissance, I should say. And so, there's this gap there, but you can see where they got it. They were like,
right.
oh, we just found these statues, let's copy them. So it's like, what did the Egyptians do? It is an appealing narrative to say maybe there was this previous civilization and they just started copying it, and then they didn't know where to go further because they weren't the ones who originally created it in the first place.
Right.
So they couldn't go any further. All they could do was mimic this ancient civilization. So it's a very appealing theory. And what I like about it, putting aside the realism and the evidence, is it sets up a concept of a golden age in the past. And when we talk about the rise and falls of civilization, the myth of your civilization, what is it founded on? Is it founded that the past was evil and yucky and we want to get away from that and we want to progress? Or is it founded on the idea that the past was perfection and we're really just trying to get back to that? Those different narratives seem to influence the future direction of the civilization.
Right. And I was going to say something similar in that an important aspect of moral theory is that if just looking at it descriptively, morality is always handed down. Our ancestors, at any given point, our ancestors have more collective human experience and know more about the human condition than we do. Now, the difference between the medieval Aristotelian civilization and the Renaissance Platonic civilization is that the Aristotelian civilization was about handing down a craft. And so the conception of the mores being handed down was linear and temporal. Whereas once you get the Platonic texts being brought in from the Eastern Empire, the Medici family being influential in this, and then the Hermetica also coming out in this same time period, what you get is pointing back to the universal mathematical and archetypal aspects that kind of provide the key to unlock the technique of the art. And you do see a flourishing of art in that context. So this basically kind of corresponds to two different popular theories of ethics, one being deontological ethics, that morality really does come down superordained from some higher level of reality. That's the Platonic sense. Or it's consequentialist, and it's inherited from just what works in this local context. That's Aristotelian, and that's like Aristotle believed in daimonistic ethics, basically, at the end of the day, as the highest ideal, which clearly didn't pan out in terms of that creativity. I think so what the pleasure-seeking mentality does is seek to justify itself by an appeal to pragmatism. But what inevitably happens is that you exhaust all pragmatic sources because, like typical analytical and discursive thinking only has so many avenues available to it. And it's this anagogical function, a mystical function that appeals to some source that we can't reason about, that actually does, in historical time, equate to these explosive bursts of creative energy that not only enrich the arts, but ultimately lead to new technological paradigms.
Yeah, when I think about explosiveness, one has to think, I mean, if we're thinking in recent history, we talk a lot about ancient history. But if we want to talk about recent history, recent kind of explosions in technology or explosions in capability, look at architecture in Europe in the early 20th century. And you see what comes, this Bauhaus school, really popular in the 20s. And it comes out and it's talking about we need to focus on the materials in themselves. We need to get down to almost the molecular level of what we're dealing with. That needs to be.
I'm sorry, what was this school called again? Can you say that?
It's called the Bauhaus School. That's Bauhaus. So it literally means build house or building house. And it was heavily influenced by Marxism. So a lot of the people in this movement were Marxists. And it was, at that time, Marxism and communism was trying to infiltrate the arts, and it was trying to stake its claim and say, we're going to come up with a new theory of artwork. I mean, people talk about cultural Marxism today as being the evolution of Marxism, but that's not the case. Cultural Marxism was really how Marxism started out because it didn't have the state power to implement economic Marxism. So all it had was cultural Marxism. Then all of a sudden it gained state power. It was able to influence certain economies. Out as a cultural movement, it started out in things like the Bauhaus movement. And the Bauhaus movement is still, popular today with certain architects, but people forget the ideological origins. And there was actually this counter-revolution, or you could say counter-reformation even, against the Bauhaus movement, and trying to understand, why were the Marxists so attracted to it? What appeal did they see in it? And from my paradigm, it's breaking down everything in architecture to the emotions, and here the materials are symbolic of the emotions. And so what the reaction to that was saying we need to get away from this focus on the materials. Is it wood? Is it metal? Is it glass? Whatever. We need to start focusing on the holistic whole. And for inspiration, we need to go back to ancient Greece, like the amphitheater, ancient Rome. We need to have these huge columns buildings. And there were all kinds of plans that were never actually implemented for creating buildings that would have had their own, it would have rained inside the building because the altitude of the building was such that you would have had clouds forming in the ceiling and you would have had actually precipitation in the building. So, we can't really conceive of something like that today because all buildings are utilitarian. You wouldn't want it to rain inside your building. There's no purpose for that. But they were focused on the gargantuan aspect of it, inspiring awe, this aesthetic sense, the tradition of ancient Greece as representing the highest aesthetic sense, and trying to take that and run with it. And corresponding with this architectural movement, it's kind of, chicken or egg. Was it the fact that these nationalist governments took it on and therefore it kind of went along for the ride, or was this part of a cultural movement that actually brought them into power? So there is a kind of feedback loop there. But ultimately, you look at those nationalist governments, the explosiveness in going from, contained powers that were on the brink of collapse, powers that, were on the decline. And then you see this explosive growth, which is then just, cut off. And after 1945, pretty much everyone except Francisco Franco is taken out. So, it has a short life and it has a quick death of growth there. So when we talk about aesthetics and you talk about the idea of a Parthenon, or you talk about the idea of these pyramids of Giza or something, and they're somehow inspiring or they're somehow connected with this explosive technological growth, we have to remember Egypt had this huge military supremacy. I mean, they had an extremely powerful military. So when we connect these things together, it's not just an ancient theory, but it's relevant to the past century, and it's still going on today. So I think countries that are going to want to experience explosive economic growth, are they just going to think purely in terms of, okay, how do we manipulate the GDP or the money markets or something? Is that going to then develop into monumentalism in art and architecture? And how is state policy going to affect the culture? I think China, especially North Korea, if you look at North Korean art, everything is monumental, everything is universal, everything is about unity and just these huge displays of power.
My interpretation of that would
the
be
nature of autocracy.
Yeah, that in North Korea's case, I think that's an inheritance of the old Soviet style, and that represents to me kind of a cargo cult of classical Vitruvian architecture, where I mean, during the Renaissance, you have people like Da Vinci kind of relearning the proportions that go into these structures and the actual formulas for what allows the arch to work and all of this stuff. But and the parts are related to the whole, and it's a lot more complexity than just monumentalism for the sake of it. And I think when you get to the Soviet period, you do get a lot of that, like, oh, well, the Egyptians built giant pyramids, let's build giant shapes. And it's just an aping and not really picking up on the key aspects of the tradition. Just like a lot of electronic music of the early 20th century, kind of experimental avant-garde stuff in classical music, just strove after complexity, just raw complexity, polyphony, but without this kind of unifying principle. Or if there was a unifying principle, it was kind of like an anti-structural principle, like serialism, like 12-tone music, where they have these artificial rules for how the tones are supposed to be combined, not having to do with any universal aspect of human nature and how we as creatures fit into the space of the musical space. But that also applies to the Vitruvian notion of architecture and the proportions of the human body actually being relevant to the construction of these structures. Well, in music, it should be the same way. And you have someone like Johann Sebastian Bach, and he's extremely complex. And by all reports, was able to sit down and compose on the fly 8-voice fugues. Like, I can't do two. I can't do it and keep the keys straight. And I've done music for a long time. So I mean, that is imitated, it's aped, that the complexity aspect of it, but then you're losing this kind of unifying component. And I kind of bring that up because Spacetime DCR asks, is Bach the greatest composer we have the music of? If yes, why would you say so? If no, who is and why? Yes, it is Bach. And I think because no one else displayed evidence of a greater mastery of counterpoint. And not just so at that time in music theory, they did not understand the harmonic phrase structure in the way that we do. Today, and from the classical period on, you had the idea of a tonic section, a predominant section, a dominant section, and a tonic section. And everything from the classical period on revolves around that. In the Baroque period, that the larger phrase structures had to do with the form of the piece, whether it was a dance, whether it was a fugue, whether it was a minuet, or most of these are dance forms in actual fact, sonata. But the form in Baroque music wasn't this kind of abstract relationship of harmonies. The harmonic structure was emergent out of the counterpoint. So all you really had as the delineating principles of the music was counterpoint, the laws of counterpoint, and the form, the inherited form of the type of music in question. Again, whether it's a jig or a minuet or a gavotte or whatever it is. So Bach demonstrated mastery of all forms of music from his time period. The only person who, from that same kind of time period, would come close would be Antonio Vivaldi, but people often say that Vivaldi basically wrote the same violin concerto 300 times, and that's uh, Bach's music is not only technically perfect all the time, and perfect in the same sense that like Mozart's music is somehow more perfect than it would have been if all of his idiosyncrasies weren't there. Like Haydn's music is all technically correct. You're not going to find wrong notes or theoretical inaccuracies in Haydn. But with Mozart, he kind of takes it a step beyond that. Bach is the same kind of way, but because of the paradigm he was operating in, because it was open to chromaticism and the emergent harmonic structure. I don't know, honestly, to what extent Bach just had a genius harmonic intuition, but Bach's harmony forms the basis for all harmony until Richard Wagner. No Western composer, no composer in the world surpasses the harmony of Johann Sebastian Bach until 1850 or later. So I think it's safe to say, and just also the reports of what he was able to do extemporaneously. And then he says something else. Space-time, anything as big as a skyscraper is a monument just because of its size. It's just a matter of what it's a monument to. I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah. On that architectural point, what I would say is there's a difference between monumentalism and gargantuanism. You could almost say there's a difference between Olympianism and Titanism. And I think this is kind of what you brought me back on track with the North Korea thing enough and trying to, piece out what are these governments doing? You have the capitalist governments, and we know what modern art looks like. Modern art looks like you took a bunch of matchsticks and you threw them in a pile, and that's a modern art. So it's all about how much time did you spend on it. And that's a kind of gargantuanism. Look at the gargantuan amount of time I spent on this piece. But where's the perfection? Where is the unifying principle? Where's the order? Where's the hierarchy? Well, they forgot about that. And it's kind of the same thing with these communist governments or Soviet governments. They're building something gargantuan. It was wrong of me to say monumental. They're building something gargantuan. They say, look how big it is. That shows our power. But there's no unity. There's no order. There's no hierarchy. There's no harmony in it. It's just a thing. Sometimes you go to these Western European countries and they've just got a big sphere. It's just a big sphere, dildo, or just some giant shape that's just there. And it's so simple. And there's some kind of asceticism to it, but obviously it's not asceticism. In the East, in India, and in places like the traditional Buddhist art, you just got a big Buddha. He's a huge Buddha. And maybe there's something aesthetic about that, but it's the same Buddha over and over again. There's nothing creative about it. So when I say monumentalism,
at least there
has to be harmony, there has to be unity.
At least there, though, the repetition itself, the fact that it's participating in a tradition, does provide that unifying factor. There's much more to the statue of the Buddha than just the physical materials of the statue. Whereas some of this modern art, like the whole point is just presenting the raw materials. Maybe you welded a bicycle and some mannequin together, and you're going to call that art. But and you're right that it's parallel, or I guess inverse to the aesthetic experience of mystery, like being presented with a mystery. Rituals in church, especially the Orthodox Church, are kind of like this. You do have a sense of the monumental, or I guess more to the point would be a sense of the sublime, and that is very different. You don't get the sense of the sublime from contemporary art, which can be gargantuan and can be puzzling. And it doesn't satisfy the sense, it's not even hedonistic. It doesn't satisfy that aspect. It doesn't strive towards any higher ideal. What it strives towards is a complete dismantling of the aesthetic structures that are typical. And actually,
It's
I
an
think
attack.
you can see Schoenberg's 12-tone music, Webern, and all of the early atonalists in the same vein, where they're really the 12-tone idea is deconstructing the natural harmonic series and hierarchy of functions in within the key and rendering all notes equal. You have to repeat, or you have to play all 12 notes before you can repeat any. That's the whole idea of the theory. And it's intentionally anti-music. It's anti-aesthetic, it's anti-sensuous, it's against the doctrine of the affect. And you know, why, what are they even going for there? Is this something beyond the three levels of traditional morality? Is this actually something like a positive evil in and of itself?
Emotionalist art, if you want to look at art that inspires emotion, uh, people don't like to call pornography art, but I think if you really want to get to what is just focused on the lust, on the base animal emotions, you have pornography, you have horror films, you have these slaughter. Look at the ISIS videos; they're just cutting off people's heads. That is a kind of emotionalist art. People don't like to call it art because it's terrorism. You can't call it art because we have this history of referring to art in a positive sense. That's because we come from this aesthetic tradition where everything's going toward God in artwork. Obviously, that's not the case. There's something outside of the aesthetic tradition, and now we're colliding with those other traditions. And this, yeah, so there is an emotionalist art. We see that in Hollywood. We see it in the porn industry. But then there is obviously an aesthetic art. You look at traditional calligraphy, just focusing on the words. There is an aestheticism about that. The giant blob or the modern art is not trying to inspire emotions. It's not trying to get you to meditate, and it's not trying to get you closer to God. It is purely negative. It is purely deconstructive. It is an invert. It's so simplistic and it's so stupid, but they hold it up because they really hate aesthetics. They hate aesthetics. They want to invert it. They say, well, aesthetics is about perfection, so we're going to say take something imperfect. Aesthetics is about some eternal form, something that will last. So we'll just make something ephemeral for the sake of it. We're going to just anything that's beautiful. Okay, just flip it and make ugliness. It's not smart. It's not. There's nothing. No genius behind it. But what is behind it is a kind of passion that these people have, a kind of hatred that they have. They do have a kind of drive and a will behind them to destroy. And you could say it's a kind of consumerism. They are taking an aesthetic system that has been built up, and their method of consumption is, oh, you like beauty? Well, haha, here's ugliness. And there's a kind of humility. It's like when a little kid, you build something, and a little kid comes up and kicks it down and says, haha, and they get some kind of pleasure out of it. I think that's kind of the sadistic pleasure these artists get out of saying, oh, put poop on the ground, and now you have to come pay $50 to go in a museum and see it. And it's like a very sick joke. So yeah, is that outside of the three systems? I actually think it's within the aesthetic tradition, but it's an inversion of the aesthetic tradition in a way. It's not an appeal to emotionalism.
Right. And I think my experience with like young musicians being impressionable, and I went through a phase where I genuinely enjoyed listening to atonal music. And I just want to put myself back in that mentality. And what is it? I guess it's actually completely analogous to the self-hate that whites feel today. It is a self-destructive aesthetic. And I don't think that the originators of these traditions, by and large, were themselves self-destructive personalities. I do think they were sadistic and not masochistic. And I do view
Yes.
all of this as weaponized art or anti-art rather than just like corruption or degeneracy. It's not it's like it is producing degeneracy, but it's not that they're degenerates, it's that they're smart
Right.
and they understand what's going to erode the foundation of a civilization.
And it's not even, you don't even have to take a conspiratorial thing where it's like, oh, they made this piece of music in order to destroy our society or something. It was like, no, they were thinking in more idealistic terms than that. They weren't thinking practically, like, I'm going to write this music and it's going to have this pragmatic effect
No,
necessarily.
I think some of them were. I
No,
think
no, I
Schoenberg
think I agree that
for
it can
sure.
be a mix of both, but I'm saying that you can theoretically have someone who has no pragmatic intentions. They have no hope of destroying society, but they hate it by its essence, and so they try to produce an anti-essence. And so ultimately, modern art is within the Western tradition by virtue of it being an inversion of the Western tradition. And well, and to go back to the three moral systems, it would then be an inversion of aesthetics. So yeah, it is a sadism, and people who consume sadism, that is a masochistic act. If
Hmm.
someone who enjoys, I don't know, if someone enjoys watching like the ISIS execution videos, you're either someone who's very sadistic or there's something very masochistic there. It is an extreme negativity, and negativity, its corollary is positivity. The positive corollary of modern art is classical art. And it's not. I don't know. What would be a corollary for the classical asceticism of East Asia, the calligraphy? What would the corollary be? Maybe it's anime. Maybe anime is the commodified corollary. And then as for
But
emotionalism, that's a little more simple. You have happy pieces and unhappy pieces, or something like that.
yeah, I think emotionalist music or an inversion of that might be death metal, but it's earnest. It's like it's an inversion. I think there's a genuine artistic instinct to reflect the society in which you're living, and so even noble people will produce ugliness in a society which is itself ugly. Just trying to make sense of it,
Oh,
like at a
certainly.
psychological. What?
I think there is this justification behind certain ugly forms of art. Oh, we're not trying to celebrate ugliness. We're actually trying to make people think about ugliness, and we're trying to confront them with this problem so we can come up with solutions. And I think there's something legitimate about that. Usually, it's gone about in the wrong way, or it's a false message. But I can see how people who want beauty in the world actually are really driven to depict ugliness. Like you can look at some. I think what is the Spanish? It's a painting by a Spanish painter. At near the end of his life, he's in his pessimism, and it's this monster eating off the head of a human figure or something. So it's a very ugly painting, but it's ugly in the sense that it's trying to convey a sense of ugliness and not actually be how do I say that? It's not meant to be an inversion of aesthetics in the fact that it took technical skill. It took, there are different, counterpoints of light and darkness and whatever. Uh, so, it's the portrayal of ugliness. You look at even classical Christian artwork where, you have the depiction of heaven and you have the depiction of hell. They
Right.
didn't depict hell because the painter was like, oh, yeah, hell is awesome. Like, I love hell. It's like, no, I really want people to see what these creatures look like. I want people to get the message so that they can be saved. Like, that's sometimes my problem with Christians is they want to hide all the nasty stuff. They have this puritanical, sanitary sense of artwork, that artwork should only be a depiction of Christ,
Hmm.
or only these nice sanitized images. But then sometimes you forget that Christ is on the cross and he's enduring suffering. And so right there, you have to go back to that and see, like, okay, a depiction of suffering, a depiction of ugliness and pain can motivate people toward good, and it can be produced by good people.
Yeah. Just
So
once, I'd
yeah,
like to
the whole
walk
like
in to a Protestant church and hear uh, a fire and brimstone, you're going to hell sermon. I'd love to hear that. But
Yeah, but what I love even more is to hear Dies Irae, because they used to play that. I mean, it was composed as a theological song that you could play in church. You're never going to hear that played in church. It's like, oh, that's too, and they think of it as an emotional piece, and maybe there's emotional aspects to it. But they think of it like if you started playing that in church, they'd be like, "Oh, you're disrespecting the service. We only have positivity in here. It's only good vibes, man. We just have good vibes in this church," and that's like so universal. And I just think things like death metal, black metal, that is to me, I see that in the tradition of a piece like Dies Irae, which is like,
mm-hmm.
you're all going to hell, like repent now or face, the devil or something like that. Like there is that part of the Western tradition that I feel sometimes Christians reject because they're like, oh, we're not supposed to celebrate ugliness. But sometimes I don't think it's a celebration. I think it's like you're really presenting it to people,
yeah, it's
and propagandizing
confrontation more than a celebration, and that goes all the way back to the earliest rituals of the Indo-Europeans and the sacrifice, the act of it was gruesome. You had to see the bloodiness and gore of life, and I picked up a like an anthology of the pre-Socratics, and it's this section on Orpheus, but they recount the myth of Persephone and Demeter, and Demeter's going down to ask these mortal women who may have seen where Persephone went, but she doesn't let them know that she's Demeter, and she like takes the mortal women give Demeter, without knowing it's Demeter, their baby to hold for a second, and she puts the baby in the fire and like kills the baby and like, I am Demeter, where is Persephone? And like brutality underlying reality. Life is suffering. That realization does need to be present. I got a little, I saw it read out my mic there, but that realization does need to be presented. It's just a matter of, is it in a genuine spirit? Is it an authentic spirit? Is it tying into some kind of like ultimate ideal on which this suffering has meaning, or are you just presenting suffering and pure nihilism? So unless you had something to say, I actually kind of want to bring it back to Plato real quick. Okay.
Just bring it back. Bring it to Plato.
So, well, in the Republic, I believe, if I remember correctly, he talks about why we find things beautiful. And it's because of our experience before we were brought to the earth, when we apprehended the realm of forms. And the highest form being the ideal of the good. And he talks about how, like, sensuously indulgent people who are very clouded by the illusion of life and ephemeral pleasures, those people aren't even moved by higher aesthetic experiences. But people who have gone through it recently enough, when a beautiful form is present to them, the experience of that beauty is a recollection or an anamnesis of that unity that the beauty represents. And the beauty of aesthetics is only beauty because it partakes in the ultimate one, or simplicity, or divinity, goodness, God, that gives meaning to the beauty that we know. And likewise, like ephemeral pleasures, hedonistic pleasures, they have a place in like a traditional Christian worldview, because God coming to the earth, it does deify man to an extent, and thereby all of our activities, even the less savory activities that we partake in the divine nature to some extent, and so have some higher reference than just the raw presentation of whatever they are to the senses. Now, contrast that with this purely destructive, breaking down the forms that we know, not confronting us with the suffering of the world, in light of a higher ideal of transcendence, just the suffering, just the presentation of raw suffering and disharmony and dissonance, and it's what you hear um, when you turn on the radio a lot of the time. So that's how you would. Like, we talked a lot about
Well, I think
aesthetics, but just to bring it, like, what does it have to do with morality? The beautiful is the good.
mentioned public hanging, and public hanging was I mean, in the American South, they were hanging people in the 1930s and so on. But public hanging was outlawed in Britain in the 19th century, and there was a big debate about whether you should have it or not. And there was a utilitarianism about does it discourage criminality. And these Puritans came in and said that's not civilized, and we need to hide that, and not it needs to be a private execution. So, and then it's gotten to the point where we're talking about should we even have execution at all? And so it's this constant hiding and running away from, death and the thanatos. And so when you remove death from life, when you don't have that counterbalance, things kind of middle out, and then you don't have the extreme vitality and vigorousness.
Hmm.
And so, I mean, that's probably the reason I'd be in favor of public hangings is not because I like to see it, but because I don't like to see it. And because I don't like to see it, seeing those public hangings actually drives me in a vigorous direction to do good.
Hmm.
So, I think you could even say that's part of the power of the Holocaust is that you're thinking of these bodies being bulldozed into ditches, and it's from a very young age you're presented with that in America, and then the strong corollary is that I guess like Judaism is good and like it was a really good war and everyone who fought in that war on the Allied side was a really, really good person and you can never insult their memory and so on and so forth. So by presenting that extreme negativity, there's actually this extreme positive reaction. And when you think about heroism in our culture, what was a good war? Everyone says, oh, all wars are bad. What about World War II? Oh, well, that was the exception. So you're actually able to deconstruct the entire morality of anti-war, cultural relativism, pacifism. You're able to deconstruct that all for a moment because of the negativity of what the Holocaust represents. And then you finally get this positive, heroic model that can still be celebrated, but it has to be celebrated corresponding with the negativity of the Holocaust. If you don't have the Holocaust, you can't have the heroism of the warriors. In any other context, oh, people who fought in Vietnam, those were monsters, those were criminals, or they were victims of capitalism. It's always presented in a negative fashion. World War II, they were heroes. They were almost have like a godlike status or something. They're like our ancient ancestors, the way people think about it. Those were the golden years, the golden generation. So I mean, it is present in our society. It's just directed in a different,
Right.
goal, basically, than if you had something like public hangings.
The people who were responsible for writing the history of World War II, they understand the power of traditional literary forms, and the same goes for contemporary uh, film, popular cult, like mass media culture. Film composers are the only composers who are still masters of tonal music by and large, and they understand these universal aspects of human emotion, how to evoke very particular feelings to correspond to particular scenes. And it's interesting that where it's necessary as an instrument of their propaganda, they preserve tradition. But anywhere else, like anywhere where tradition could be used in its own context for its own sake as an affirmation of Western society, then we don't want it. But if it's a movie that's like pushing miscegenation and a Holocaust narrative, then throw in all this, pull out all the stops and have some Wagnerian music playing.
Definitely. I mean, and that's one I'm not nearly as musically educated as you are, but loved like from a young age. I love these musical scores, and I'm like, this doesn't make sense. Musical scores is not a genre of music in the way that like I think of rock or classical or something like this, and I'm like, this doesn't make sense. But then when you say that, it's like, okay, yes, it's this heroism, it's this affirmation, this positivism, yearning for life or something. So there is this harmony that is allowed because you have to have some. It's almost like if they completely took that out of society, if they banned harmonious music, if there was no place for that, it would almost be like someone in their basement would be like writing fugues or like trying to do something, and then that would get out and people would be like, oh my god, this it would be like light coming into a dark world, and they'd be like, oh, whoever this person is, we have to worship them. I think it would be dangerous by its absence. It would then become like a dangerous substance, a contraband. Have some kind of controlled opposition to their moral system, where they say, no, 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 you can still be heroic. You just have to be like a Marvel superhero with like Black Panther and the Wakandans. I just watched Avengers, Infinity War, and the Wakandans. They're so heroic. They're such perfect, noble, moral agents. And you watch that, and you're like, why can't white people be like this? Why do white people always have to be like, they're morally divided, and like Batman, he's trying to do good, but he has this dark side. But they're like the perfect, like innocent, platonic heroes. So they have to have it. They have to be able to express it in some capacity, but they do so tactically, and they do so in a way that isn't really dangerous to the system that they've set up.
Yeah. Um, that brings so kind of setting out. I thought about moral realism versus nihilism. Um, I have heard, sorry, Spacetime DCR. Have you guys heard Steve Reich's duet for two violins? I have heard it. Steve Reich's music is great the first three times you listen to it. And then after that, it's like I've heard enough of the measure being repeated over and over. There are a few contemporary composers that I'm fond of, tonal, like good composers. I think one of those that doesn't really fit in that category would be Ervo Pärt, who writes very, very simplistic, like triad, just bare bones harmonies, and like it's kind of like an extension of minimalism, I guess. That was a kind of a reaction against serialism in the early electronic music and everything, but that's simplistic. One interesting composer would be David Mislanka, who was a big. He's still alive, but he writes a lot of wind ensemble music, and I've played in wind ensembles, so that's why I know it. But very mystical and traditional, and but at the same time completely new. Like you do have the sense that you're listening to new music. But anyway, what I was the track I was trying to get on was that at the outset I wanted to talk about nihilism versus moral realism, and we got kind of sidetracked into aesthetics, but I think that's where the conversation naturally needs to go, because how do we know that there is such a thing as the objective good? I think it's because everyone acknowledges that there is such a thing as the objectively beautiful, or at least objectively like skilled work of art. We can all acknowledge masterpieces, unless we're this kind of countercultural force. But then taking it down beyond that level of the aesthetic that we started with, acknowledging the beautiful, even if you don't acknowledge the good at the higher level, everyone acknowledges pleasure. But the logical implication of that is that there's something there. There is some real element that you're perceiving that corresponds to the pleasure. And kind of dismissing it as arbitrary preference or just, it's you can't, if you want to have a coherent picture of the world, once you acknowledge that there is pleasure, you have to acknowledge that there are principles of what leads to pleasure. And then you construct universals of types of pleasure, and then higher types of pleasure. Pleasure that, sustains itself, pleasure that's short-lived. Like there are these forms. And as we reject that, like you can see that the people pushing out the culture, the same basic people who are putting out really sinister cultural elements, also rely on those traditional forms, also acknowledge them. Like, basically, Satan knows that objective morality is real. Satan knows what the good is. He's the one who introduced us to it. He's the one who got us to eat of the fruit of the tree, of the knowledge of good and evil. So Satan knows. He just tricks those of us who are gullible. And so, in the face of that, what do you do? Go in your basement and compose some fugues. I like that suggestion.
Yeah. On the subject of moral realism, I kind of like that the tripartite Christian painting where you got Christ, he's got one hand, the other hand, and there's heaven and there's hell, and it just presents it as a choice. One can come along and say like, oh, I am a masochist. I would love to get, forked in the ass with a big pitchfork or something. I would love to have my body cut apart. And you have people who are that way. And you just say, you're going toward death. And I think for me, that is an objectively real thing. There is life and there is death. And so is that then a survivalist mentality of, well, anything you can do to preserve your life? Well, we have different identities of life. I mean, the cell in your body is living, and if it attempts to reproduce itself with disregard for the whole organism, that's called cancer. That's called a tumor, and it acts essentially parasitically. But there's obviously a larger identity of it wants to pass on the DNA, and you can look on a molecular level and say that this is a kind of the organism is a kind of preservation of the self. So then you get to that level and you're like, okay, it's not just about me living to 120 or trying to buy life extending drugs or whatever, eat leafy greens or something like that. It's then how do I preserve my self being entire organism that's around me?
Right. It's so that always it's
yeah.
a very stark contrast between the whole foods kind of like avoid all GMOs, avoid chemical house cleaners, but at the same time like, oh, my race is dying out. Like
Let in mass immigration. Something like that. Yeah, so it is interesting. It is interesting. Like that basic drive for life is there. Like the Whole Foods people, they want to live, but they conceive of life as purely individual. Like even if they won't say that, like, no, of course I want the entire environment. And environmentalists do the same thing. They'll say, oh, I want the entire planet to survive. I want to preserve biodiversity. And then, while they're talking about the entire planet, the health of the entire planet, then, they can't think about it on like, okay, well, who's more healthy for the planet? The Chinese, the Africans, or the Europeans? And they'll come up with a way to say like the Europeans are the worst for the planet. But of course, that's not true. I mean, like you can manipulate things to say like, oh, they're overpopulated or whatever. But actually go to these places. Go to these places and tell me that you really think, yeah, the Europeans, they're just destroying the environment. Whereas, the Brazilians are living in harmony with the Amazon. That's not happening. So, yeah, there's so many people in the hippie movement and in the left who do have a drive for life. They want to preserve life. They want to choose life over death. But it's a question of, and how do you fit into life? Like, what is your place within a hierarchy of living things? Are you a plant, or are you actually a human being that is part of a community, that is part of, a larger culture or something like that? Place yourself within that. And, you don't have to be then sadistic about animals and like, I mean, like I would be very happy if we stopped factory farming. I would be very happy if we stopped cruelty to animals. I don't like cruelty to animals. So the fact that I identify as a human, identify as a cis white male, humanoid, blah, blah, blah. That's my identity. And so it doesn't mean that I have to hate all these animals or disregard their suffering. It's myself within that context. Scientology actually has this as one of its basic tenets is that like it's an onion and first you're an individual and then you're the community. And like this is really basic stuff that like any religious system should address. but then like these new agey people, and I kind of think that contemporary Christianity is a new age religion in a way. These new agey people, they're skipping around the onion layers and they're not contextualizing themselves. They're not placing themselves within a hierarchy, and they're just jumping from, okay, I care about the whole planet, but to care about your race is really bad and evil. But then I also care about myself as an individual. So they're kind of skipping all over the place, and they don't have a harmonious picture of things. It's a tactical package that has been sold to them ultimately, and they've been gullible enough to buy into it.
Mm-hmm. And it probably derives from nominalism. I think a lot of the susceptibility of modern peoples to this kind of cultural subversion has to do with our inability to believe in universals. Like there's nothing beyond particular sensations, nothing beyond particular individuals. And, the position quickly fades into decoherence if you actually investigate it. But when you get down to it, like when you say that there's no such thing as objective morality, when you say that there's not a hierarchy of values leading to that summum bonum, there's not an absolute highest good, then you're effectively saying there's no truth. I think that's my belief when you actually really get down to it. But this has been a good discussion, and I think that's, to my mind, where I'd like to go. Maybe not next time we pick this up. We can talk about something else on Saturday. But I'd like to get Ivan the Heathen. If anyone can message him, I'm going to message him. I'd like to have him on to discuss nominalism in this context and the relationship to the good and the true. So, any last thoughts to wrap it up?
All good on my end.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Ken. And I didn't even dox you today. I'm very proud of myself. We'll talk on Saturday.
I'm just going to ignore that. It's all going to be good. Thank you for listening, everybody. We'll see you next time.
Yep. Bye-bye.